There is a moment that nobody warns you about. A moment so quiet, so unremarkable on the outside, that most people who witness it do not even realize what they are watching. But if you are an empath, and you have lived long enough inside the particular exhaustion that comes from over-explaining yourself to people who were never truly listening, then you already know what that moment feels like from the inside. It is the moment you stop, not the moment you give up, not the moment you become cold, or detached, or indifferent to the people around you. It is something far more precise than any of those things. It is the moment the system inside you, the one that has been running without pause since you were old enough to sense that the emotional atmosphere of a room required your management, finally stops producing explanations as its default output. And when this happens, something deeply strange occurs in the people around you. They become uncomfortable. Not because you have done anything wrong, not because you have withdrawn your love, or your presence, or your attention, but because something they were unconsciously depending upon has suddenly ceased to function in the way they expected. And here's the truth most people miss. That discomfort is not about you at all. It is about what your silence has just revealed about them. You must understand something about the psychology of over-explanation before you can enter, which should understand why stopping it carries so much weight. Over-explanation is not simply a communication style. It is not a personality quirk, or a tendency toward verbosity, or even a sign of intellectual enthusiasm. For the empath, over-explanation is a survival mechanism. It is one of the most sophisticated and least examined forms of emotional labor that exists within human relationships. It begins early. Long before the empath has language to describe what they are doing, they develop a particular orientation toward the emotional states of other people. They learn that confusion in others produces tension. That tension, unmanaged, can escalate into conflict. And conflict, in the environments where many empaths were formed, was something to be prevented at nearly any cost. So the empath becomes an anticipator, a translator, a preemptive diffuser of misunderstandings that have not yet occurred but could, at any moment, begin to form. Over time, this becomes automatic. Every statement is accompanied by context. Every action is pre-explained before it is taken. Every boundary, on the rare occasions one is attempted, arrives wrapped in so many layers of justification and apology that by the time the empath finishes speaking, the boundary itself has been all but dissolved. This is not weakness. You must understand that clearly. It is a pattern that was shaped by a psyche intelligent enough to recognize that in certain niching environments, clarity without softening was dangerous. The over-explanation was not a sign of insecurity. It was a form of protection. But what the psyche that developed this pattern never had the opportunity to learn is that the protection it offered was not free. Every explanation extracted a cost. Every justification consumed energy that was never replenished. And every time the empath over-explained, they were also, unconsciously, sending a signal to the people around them. A signal that said, "I do not trust that my presence alone is sufficient." A signal that said, "I need your understanding in order to feel safe proceeding." A signal that, over years and decades, became the invisible architecture upon which entire relationships were built. This is not emotional. It is structural. The over-explanation became the load-bearing wall of a dynamic that most people in the empath life had never consciously examined, but had nonetheless come to depend upon entirely. And once this happens, once the empath's explanations become the structural foundation of how others relate to them, a very particular and very dangerous equilibrium is established. The empath explains. The other person receives that explanation as a form of permission, or reassurance, or regulation. The system functions. Both parties continue. But the empath, inside this system, is doing all of the invisible work. They are managing the emotional temperature of every exchange. They are providing the interpretive framework through which the other person understands not only what the empath does, but why they are permitted to have done it at all. Here's the truth most people miss. The people who benefit from this system almost never recognize that it exists. They do not experience the empath's explanations as labor. They experience them as simply the way that person communicates. They have no awareness that what they are receiving is not natural generosity, but rather a deeply conditioned response to the unconscious threat of disapproval, withdrawal, or conflict. They have built their understanding of the empath entirely around access to that running, internal commentary, and when it stops, they do not know what they are looking at. What if the most significant shift in an empath, psychological life, is not the moment they begin to heal, or the moment they discover their own boundaries, or even the moment they recognize the patterns that have governed their behavior for years? What if the most significant shift is simply the moment they close their mouth and let the silence speak for them? And what if that silence, so unremarkable from the outside, carries within it the entire weight of a pattern recognition threshold that has finally been crossed? This is where everything changes, and it changes not with a dramatic declaration, not with a confrontation, not with an ultimatum or an explanation or a defense. It changes with the quiet, almost imperceptible decision to stop performing psychological labor that was never yours to carry in the first place. To understand what happens when the empath stops explaining, you must first understand what was happening beneath every explanation they ever gave. Because the explanation itself was never really about information. It was never primarily about making something clear. At its deepest structural level, the empath's compulsion to over-explain was a response to a very specific internal signal. A signal that the psyche had learned to generate automatically whenever it detected the possibility of being misunderstood, disapproved of, or abandoned. This signal is what I would call the detachment sequence, and it operates in a way that most empaths have never been given language to describe, even though they have felt it running through every significant relationship in their life. The detachment sequence begins not with the act of explaining, but with the perception that an explanation will be necessary. The empath enters a room, or sends a message, or makes a decision, and even before the other person has had any visible reaction, the psyche has already begun constructing a justification, already preparing the scaffolding of context that will be offered preemptively, before disapproval can even form. This anticipatory labor is perhaps the most exhausting dimension of the empath's experience, because it means they are never truly present in any interaction. There is always a part of their awareness operating one step ahead, scanning for potential misalignment, pre-constructing bridges across gaps that do not yet exist and may never exist. The body is in the room, but a significant portion of the psyche is in the future, managing a conflict that has not yet happened, offering explanations to a version of the other person who has not yet spoken. And once this happens, once the psyche has established this forward-scanning orientation as its default mode, it begins to produce a very particular relationship to silence. The empath's own silence becomes threatening to them, not because silence is dangerous in itself, but because silence, in the environment where this pattern was formed, once meant something was wrong. Silence meant the other person was displeased. Silence meant the atmosphere was unstable. Silence meant that the empath had failed to adequately manage the emotional field, and that consequences were approaching. This is the pattern recognition threshold, the specific point at which the empath's nervous system, having been conditioned by enough repetitions of this sequence, begins to treat the absence of explanation as a form of exposure. Silence feels dangerous, not because it is, but because the psyche has learned, through experience, that unexplained behavior, in the presence of others, creates vulnerability. And so the explanations continue. Not because the empath consciously chooses to justify themselves, but because the system has been running long enough that the choice no longer feels like a choice at all. But what most people don't realize is what this ongoing pattern produces in the people who receive it, because the effect of chronic over-explanation on the person receiving it is not neutral. When someone consistently explains themselves without being asked, when they consistently provide justification before accountability has been requested, they are also, unconsciously, teaching the other person how to relate to them. They are teaching the other person that emotional access to them requires no effort, that their inner world is always open, always interpretable, always available for consumption. That clarity about the empath's motives, feelings, and reasons is something the other person is simply entitled to have. Over time, this teaches the other person to expect transparency without reciprocity, to receive emotional labor without offering it in return, to exist in the relationship as a consumer of the empath's self-explanation while never submitting their own interior world to the same quality of examination. This asymmetry is not always malicious. In many cases, the people who benefit from this dynamic are not consciously exploiting anything. They have simply been educated, through years of consistent experience, to understand that the empath is the one who does this particular kind of work, and so they stop doing it themselves. This is the structural truth that most conversations about empathy never reach. The problem is not simply that the empath gives too much. The deeper problem is that the pattern of over-explanation trains the relational system to can function without requiring anything from the other side. It creates a relational architecture that is asymmetrical by design, even when both parties believe the relationship is equal. And here's the truth most people miss. The inequality is invisible precisely because the empath has been so consistent, so thorough, so preemptively generous with their self-disclosure, that no one in the system has ever had to notice what they are not providing in return. This is also why the empath's silence, when it finally arrives, produces such an outsized reaction, because the silence does not merely remove an explanation. It removes the entire infrastructure that the other person has been unconsciously using to navigate the relationship. Suddenly, there is no pre-packaged context, no anticipatory justification, no offer of emotional transparency before it has been requested. The empath is simply present, without the running commentary, without the interpretive scaffolding, without the perpetual labor of making themselves legible to someone who never learned to read them on their own terms. And this is where the emotional recalibration begins. Not in the empath, in the other person. Because the other person, suddenly confronted with a silence they do not know how to interpret, experiences something they may not have encountered in this relationship before. Uncertainty. They do not know what the empath is thinking. They do not know how the empath is feeling. They do not have access to the empath's interior state, and for the first time, that access is not being offered. The discomfort this produces is not simply social awkwardness. It is the discomfort of a system encountering conditions it was never designed to handle. And once this happens, once the other person begins to feel the weight of that uncertainty, something revealing occurs. Their response to the uncertainty tells the empath everything they need to know about the purpose, nature of what the relationship has actually been. Some people will lean in, they will ask questions, they will begin, perhaps for the first time, to do the work of trying to understand the empath without being handed everything prearranged. These people are capable of real connection. Their response to the silence is an attempt at genuine encounter. But other people will do something else entirely. They will escalate. They will become demanding or accusatory, or wounded in a way that feels strangely performative. They will interpret the absence of the empath, so habitual transparency, not as a change in communication style, but as an act of aggression, as a withdrawal of something they were owed. This reaction is the most important data point in the entire transformation, because it reveals, with absolute precision, that for these people, the relationship was never truly about the empath as a person. It was about the function the empath performed, the emotional labor they provided, the self-explanation they offered as a form of perpetual accessibility. When that function ceases, there is nothing underneath it that those people know how to value. And so the discomfort they feel is not the discomfort of missing the empath. It is the discomfort of a system that has lost one of its essential mechanisms. And the empath, watching this unfold from the unfamiliar quiet of their own interior, begins to understand something they could never have learned any other way. Something that no amount of explanation, or justification, or self-disclosure could have taught them. They begin to understand who was truly there. There is something that occurs inside the empath during this stage that is almost impossible to describe to someone who has not experienced it. It is not triumph. It is not the satisfaction of having finally established a boundary or claimed a victory in some invisible relational contest. It is something quieter than either of those things, something more disorienting and more permanent. It is the experience of encountering oneself without the mediation of the other person's reaction. For the empath who has spent years, perhaps decades, generating explanations as a form of emotional regulation, the interior silence that follows the cessation of that pattern does not feel like freedom at first. It feels like exposure. Because all of the attention and energy that was previously directed outward toward the management of other people's understanding is now redirected inward. And what the psyche discovers in that redirected attention is not always comfortable. It finds suppressed needs that were never voiced because the empath was too occupied with managing others to examine their own. It finds unexpressed opinions that were softened into invisibility, adjusted and readjusted until they bore no resemblance to what the empath actually thought, because the original thought seemed too likely to require an explanation that felt too costly to give. It finds a version of the self that was present all along, but was never given enough quiet to become articulate. And this encounter, this turning of the perceptive apparatus back toward oneself rather than perpetually outward, is the beginning of what I would call the identity shift principle. The identity shift principle does not operate the way most people imagine psychological change to operate. It does not arrive as a revelation. It does not announce itself with dramatic insight or sudden clarity. It moves instead the way a tide moves when the conditions have finally changed. Slowly, consistently, without ceremony. One morning you notice that you have stated an opinion without appending an apology to it. One afternoon you notice that you have made a decision without constructing a preemptive case for why that decision should be permitted. One evening, you notice that a silence has fallen in a conversation, and rather than rushing to fill it with explanation, you have simply allowed it to exist. And in that allowance, something shifts. Not because the silence achieved anything externally, but because the empath, in tolerating it, has just demonstrated to themselves something their psyche has spent an entire lifetime struggling to accept. That their presence does not require constant justification. That their interior world does not belong to anyone else by default. That the comfort of the people around them is not their sole responsibility to manufacture and maintain. This realization, once it begins, does not reverse. And this is the dimension of the transformation that carries the most profound psychological weight. Because once the pattern recognition threshold has been crossed, once the empath has seen clearly how the system of over-explanation was constructed and what it was actually for, they cannot unsee it. The compulsion to explain does not vanish immediately. Old patterns are deeply inscribed, and they continue to generate their familiar pressure for a long time after the empath begins to resist them. But the relationship to that pressure changes. What once felt like an authentic impulse to communicate now becomes recognizable as a conditioned response to anticipated disapproval. And once you can see the mechanism, it loses some of its authority over you. This is where everything changes for the empath. Not in the dramatic external confrontations that this stage sometimes produces, but in this internal recognition. The recognition that the labor they were performing was never required by the relationship. It was required by the pattern, and the pattern was not a reflection of who they are. It was a reflection of what they learned to do in order to survive environments that penalized for being anything less than perpetually transparent and accommodating. But what most people don't realize is that this recognition, liberating as it is, also carries a particular kind of grief. Because when the empath begins to see the system clearly, they also begin to see, with equal clarity, all of the places in their life where they have been relating to a version of connection that was never truly reciprocal. The friendships that were built on the empaths, emotional labor, rather than genuine mutual regard. The relationships in which the empath's worth was measured entirely by what they were willing to produce for the other person, rather than by who they actually were. The years spent crafting explanations for people who were never genuinely interested in understanding. This grief is real, and it would be dishonest to describe the identity shift principle as something that occurs without pain. It does not. There is a form of mourning that accompanies every stage of genuine psychological individuation. Not for the loss of relationships necessarily, though some relationships do not survive this transformation, but for the loss of a story, the story in which the empath believed that if they simply explained themselves thoroughly, enough, clearly enough, with enough patience and precision and compassion, they would eventually be genuinely known. The moment the empath stops explaining, they give up that story. And giving up a story you have organized your life around, even a story that was quietly destroying you, is not a painless act. And once this happens, once the grief has moved through and the silence has settled into something less frightening and more familiar, the empath arrives at a psychological position they have never occupied before. They arrive at the position of simply being present, without the running commentary, without the preemptive scaffolding of justification, without the invisible labor of making themselves perpetually legible to people who may not deserve that level of access. They are simply here, themselves, unmediated. And from this position, something that the empath could not have anticipated begins to occur. The right people, the ones who are capable of genuine encounter rather than simply consumption, begin to draw closer. Not because the empath has become easier to access, but because the empath, by ceasing to manage the emotional atmosphere of every interaction, has finally created enough interior stillness that authentic resonance has somewhere to land. The empath no longer gives off the unconscious signal of availability to everyone, and so only those who are genuinely oriented toward real connection will make the effort to establish it. This is the power reversal logic that nobody explains when they talk about empaths and boundaries. The power does not shift because the empath withholds something. It shifts because the empath stops subsidizing connection for people who were never truly invested in it. When you stop doing that work, you do not become isolated. You become selective. And selectivity, for a psyche that has spent its entire life operating from a posture of perpetual openness, is not just a boundary. It is a form of self-recognition. It is the first clear evidence the psyche has ever received that it possesses a center worth protecting. The people who grow uncomfortable when you stop explaining yourself are not uncomfortable because something is wrong with you. They are uncomfortable because something they did not know they were dependent upon has been quietly removed. And that discomfort is not your responsibility to relieve. It is information. It is the most honest thing the relationship has ever produced. And you, standing in the unfamiliar quiet of your own unmediated presence, are finally in a position to read it clearly. This is not the end of empathy. It is its most refined form. It is the form that does not require your dissolution in order to function. It is the empathy that perceives without absorbing, that understands without excusing, that remains fully present to the emotional reality of others without losing its own interior, ground. And it begins, always, in the moment that you close your mouth, let the silence exist, and wait to see who is still standing there once the work of explanation has stopped. Because what you find in that silence is not emptiness. It is, for the first time in a very long time, yourself.